Nottingham from 50 miles up the road. So my chosen title is Realist and Realistic Searching. Where do I start and how far do I go? And the title really acknowledges that although I have an information specialist background, I'm very aware of the constraints that most of you are facing when you're doing your realist projects. And so I'm something of a gamekeeper turned poacher, in that I started with the theory of what an ideal search would be, and then have worked back from that to think more about what is practical within time and resource constraints. So we gain these insights through working on great teams, and I'd like to acknowledge my two collaborators, Simon Briscoe from the University of Exeter and Judy Wright from the University of Leeds, both experienced information specialists who have specialised recently in supporting realist syntheses. And as a team with shared concerns and preoccupations, we authored a couple of publications together, and we continue to collaborate as we try and crack this very difficult nut of how do you search to support a realist review, and indeed how is it different from searching to support a systematic review. And the two items that I'll be drawing on of the collaborative ventures between the three of us. First of all, the chapter in the book Doing Realist Research, which certainly fills a gap in terms of practical advice on realist approaches. And then on the back of that, we thought that we would review the different ways that people have tackled what we have labeled in shorthand as the realist search. So we've reviewed a number of instances of realist reviews to see what search methods were most common. So there's something of a realist review paradox, that realist reviews are not systematic reviews, but they are reviews and they are systematic. And sometimes you get this myth occurring that because the realist process is such an exciting and creative one that it defies being systematic, and certainly the three of us would resist that particular claim. There is an element, I believe, that Ray Pawson, who outlined the realist review methods, pinned realist syntheses to the review movement, although stating that they're quite different, for political reasons, because there was such a widespread acknowledgement of the value of evidence syntheses. And as a consequence, it's not unusual for funders or peer reviewers or editors to look at the methods for a realist review and expect them to look like the methods for a systematic review. Our experience is that although some of the skills that you acquire from doing a systematic review can be helpful with realist reviews, is that if you follow a systematic review template for a realist review, then you end up with a realist review done badly. Excuse the grammar. And this is a nice diagram that illustrates some of the reasons for that, in contrast with the linear approach that you would see with systematic reviews, and very often you see what I have labeled elsewhere as the Big Bang approach, where you try and get all your literature together at the beginning around a focus question for a systematic review. You can see that this is a much more iterative and recursive process, and I'm indebted to Judy Wright for mapping the complexities of the realist review method, the actual search, and doing justice to some of the complexity, although the bad news is that even this is an oversimplification. There are far more feedback loops than we're able to portray here. And so just to put the two side by side to emphasize this contrast, on the left-hand side, we have the systematic review process with the structured exhaustive search. Interestingly, the exhaustive search has never been a claimed feature of systematic reviews anyway. It's even in the Cochrane Handbook, it's said that it should be as comprehensive a search as the time and resources allow, rather than doing it until the information specialist or the PhD student drops dead from exhaustion, which seems to be the currency nowadays. On the right-hand side, we have the diagram I showed you, and you can see that there are so many areas of difference here. And some of those differences are down the bottom as well, in terms of the important part played by what we call complementary searches. In the systematic review world, they're often derogatorily called supplementary searches, as if they're just plugging a gap, but we call them complementary searches for realist reviews, because they are in many cases the best source of the information that we're after, or even in some cases the only source. And Ray Pawson did draw to our attention some of the differences between searching for a realist context and searching for a systematic review context. He said that the focus of a realist review is much more on the inner workings of interventions. And so you're much more likely to have what you might call the formative literature, so the grey literature, maybe process evaluations, maybe pilot studies, the things that help to shape the intervention, rather than the more more summative literature that you get when your research project is completed and it goes into an academic journal and then onto a database. He said that the focus is on program theories rather than programs. So this means that rather than straightforward descriptions of programs that you might get in empirical studies, that you may find the value of material identified through analogy. So here we have a familiar one, that information on school league tables might help you to explain how hospital league tables work. And therefore, a tight restriction on the sources that you're going to search, the disciplines you're going to engage with, the keywords you're going to be using is often inappropriate. It can be a starting point, but it's by no means the whole journey. And the other characteristic that Ray Pawson highlighted was that very often realist reviews look beyond the treatments and the outcomes and try to look at the processes. And among the techniques that he advised was when you get hold of a program that encapsulates or embodies the intervention that you're interested in this particular example, Big Brother, that can become a useful searching, rather than common nouns such as things like mentor, or even worse, abstract nouns. But later on, when you come to the theory building and testing, and we're going to see that realism is very much based around based around theory building and testing, then in fact you find it the other way around. You're most interested in finding abstract descriptions and common nouns, and you move away from the proper nouns. And finally, the place of snowballing. So this is, you'll be familiar with this in a research context, where you go to one informant and then that informant recommends someone else that you should interview. And in the literature context, it's where you find one relevant article and use that as a starting point for citations, either backwards or forwards to further literature. Now, if you read Ray Pawson, he focuses on two R's. He focuses on the trade-off between rigor and relevance. But from my experience, I'd like to add in consideration of a third R, which stems from some of the work that I've done with qualitative synthesis, which is that you're also interested in richness. So often a lot of the contextual detail, or indeed the theoretical detail, can be missing from articles that satisfy the rigor and relevance. So for example, a randomized controlled trial would tick the rigor box. It might well meet the relevance box, but very often it has little of that useful detail that you require to populate your theory and your understanding of context. So if we can just draw this comparison here, I hope this works because I've never used this before. The systematic review search is after what we call the PICO, or strictly speaking, it's the PCOS. You've got the 4 elements that pin down like an anchor, the relevance, and then you have the study design, typically a randomized controlled trial, although it could be a qualitative study design, which is your way of obtaining the hallmark of rigor. So systematic review searches prioritize relevance and, in Boolean logic terms, the overlap of those relevant studies with the rigorous studies by trying to capture the PCOS. In contrast, the realist review search, we're looking for the context, the mechanisms, and the outcomes. And very often these are linked through the more familiar device of the intervention. Just to say that, of course, an intervention may have multiple mechanisms, and the same mechanism may be present in many different interventions. So there's a many-to-many relationship going on here. But essentially, the articles that we're trying to find to satisfy a realist review, for the context bit, we're obviously interested in relevant articles. For the rigor bit, we're interested in the relationship between the intervention and outcome. And these aren't necessarily quantitative studies, or they're not necessarily cohort or randomized controlled trial studies. Some people have argued that qualitative research is actually as causative as quantitative research. So people will say, well, if I have this happen to me, then I usually find that I feel like such and such. And so there is a causation or explanation there. So we're looking for rigor in terms of linking intervention and outcome. And then we're also looking for richness that enables us to explore the relationship between the context and the mechanisms, to get under the skin of the mechanisms, if you like, and to see the wider context. And so instead of the R&R of the systematic review, we're, if you like, interested in the raw, where any of these elements being present individually is of interest to us. But of course, the conjunction of any 2 of these elements is adding extra value. Just trying to advance my slides. Right. So when we conducted our audit, if you like, of what people did for their search approaches, we looked at a number of reviews. 35 are accounted for here, and we found 3 main methods. And hopefully those of you who are doing a realist synthesis, whether as a student or as part of a funded project, will be able to recognize these different approaches. So one approach is to specifically conduct a search for the realist project. And that's most typical, of course, for PhD students. But increasingly we're seeing that where, for example, an effectiveness message has already been established through perhaps a quantitative systematic review, that a realist project might be conceived to run alongside it. And so that project is realist only. The second approach is what we call the mushroom approach, which is where you conduct a general multi-purpose search at the beginning to try and meet a number of purposes, including perhaps the effectiveness, maybe to the cost effectiveness search as well. Maybe there's a qualitative dimension as well. And then you use a stalk or a proportion of that literature to specifically inform the realist synthesis. And of course, you can either search for that component separately within the cap of the mushroom, or you can identify the material you're going to use in the realist part of the review through the SIFT process. And then the third is a pick and place or a pick and mix type approach, where studies that are identified for any of the individual other components of a review, the effectiveness, the cost effectiveness, the acceptability, can feed into the realist synthesis. And so essentially you're finding studies to answer particular aspects or parts of the question. And so those characterize the main approaches. The mushroom or stage searches are typical of the HTA type project. I've been involved in large projects that have involved, for example, looking at postnatal depression, where we've been doing a cost effectiveness, a clinical effectiveness, and a qualitative review. And then we've also conducted a realist synthesis. Now, we made reference in our articles to a very useful document, which any of you involved in realist synthesis should familiarize yourself with, but we're just going to focus on one column of it, which is the searching part. And this is the Pawson task and time template from chapter 4 of his book, and it's referenced at the end of this presentation. And this shows that actually Pawson identified 3 main searching processes, but these were actually enumerated as a list of 4. So in our writings, we lump the the last 2 together. But there's a background or familiarization search where you're trying to get to know the area. There's a targeted search for sources of program theory. And then there's this search for empirical studies, which is either done by creating a large sampling frame and continually going back to it, or maybe a tightly focused search followed by a wider search, as on this diagram. This last component is much more like a systematic review search, but the early 2 components, the background search and the search for sources of program theory, are definitely doing something different from a systematic review. So along with Judy and Simon, we devised this 6-component approach that it's topped and tailed by formulating the question and documenting the search process. And we would argue that this is why the realist review is a systematic approach, although not a systematic review. And then you have the meat, if you like, in the sandwich, which are the 4 different search processes, which have specific techniques associated with them. And it's those that I'm going to be unpicking for you throughout most of the remainder of this presentation. So we start with a focus question. I've already introduced you to the CMO formulation, and here's an example from our HTA review, one of the first funded realist projects that I was involved in. So you've got the context, which was the prevention of postnatal depression. We actually identified 3 variations in the context. So these were interventions targeted universally, targeted selectively by population group, and those that are indicated for individuals. And those, we argued, would require quite different mechanisms and responses. The interventions that we looked, a wide range, including psychological and educational interventions. Mechanisms, I've just picked a few for illustrative purposes, but you'll see that these look very different from interventions. They're how people are reacting to the interventions. They're the response, to use the proper realist terms, and then the different outcomes that could be linked to clinical outcomes, cost outcomes, acceptability, and safety. So we start with a question like that, and it may well be that we've only got the context, intervention, and outcomes, and the mechanisms are part of the data that we start unpacking through the review process. So I've just got another freeze there. There we go. So the background search, as we say, that's as Ray Pawson says, it's around sensitization. So a good starting point are reviews, not just systematic reviews, but conventional reviews, reviews that try and unpick what's happening. They may be high-profile editorials. They may be highly cited studies, which of course are open to all sorts of bias in terms of how reliable they are, but we're looking here for relevance. We're not privileging rigor at this point. So highly cited studies are a good way into the literature because we can see how the landscape is organized, how it lines up. So we may well run filters across databases to find reviews, conventional or systematic. We may go to textbooks to get a sort of synopsis of where the state of knowledge is at the moment. We may want to find highly cited items for which we use the publish or perish software. And once we've found a useful item, we may want to go backwards by checking its references and forwards by checking more recent studies that have cited it. So this is very very serendipitous, if you like. It's browsing. It's one of the original methods highlighted by Bates, the sort of almost berry picking approach, where we're looking for things on the basis of their usefulness, their relevance. And Pawson describes this process as a range finding exercise. He very importantly also cautions that this is a good time at which to get an information professional involved, because they'll be able to help you make sure that the items that you pick are a diverse sample, so that you target different databases and you use different terms, so that this sensitization is a complete sensitization. It's not limited to a particular discipline that might give you blinkers for the rest of the project. I mentioned the publish or perish. If you take away one tip from this particular presentation, and hopefully there'll be more, it's to download this free software available from a UK academic from this particular site. It's what we've always looked for is a systematic way of searching for searching Google Scholar. So harnessing the power of Google Scholar with its access to the full texts of some of the documents, not just the abstracts, but importantly, keeping a record of our searches, the date we searched, the number of papers that we found in our search, and indeed how they rank in terms of numbers of citations and relevance. And you can see in this particular example, I know my PhD student Stephen is tuned in, so this will be familiar to him, the overlap here between men's sheds, which is the broad topic, and a particular strand that we want to investigate, that of leadership. And the conjunction of those, men's sheds in the title and leadership anywhere in the full text documents, produces a very short list there that would be a good source for either browsing for the whole review or for a subsequent stage where we're wanting to explore a likely program theory. Then we move on to the searching for program theories. This is where we have to not only look at the relevance, but we're also interested in the richness. We want things that try and explain what's going on. This might be policy documents, it might be administrative documents, it might be web pages, it might be some of the legislation, some of the controversies. It's not about searching for the programs themselves, it's searching for explanations about the programs. And again, the review literature may be helpful here, but more typically the reviews by the subject experts, the ones that we look down on in the context of a systematic review, but which are valuable in navigating a new topic area through the eyes of an expert. because we're trying to get these explanations, we'll very often use specialist databases. So we move beyond the general databases to those that are specifically targeted to the discipline or context that we're interested in. Now, just for those of you who are still grappling with realist synthesis and realist approaches, it's very important that when we talk about searches for theory, that we distinguish between two types of theory. In the bottom of the slide here, we have what are called low-level theories. And for those of you just learning the terminology, this is what we would call program theories. They're explaining a specific program, or in this example, a specific aspect of social behavior. They're grounded in a very particular context, in this case, the psychology lesson. So we're not interested in why do I fall asleep in any lessons. We're interested in a specific context there. Moving up from there, we then have mid-range theories. These are wider explanations for behavior that latch on to some similarities that may lie across different contexts. So the school league table and hospital league table example we had earlier would be an example where if we have a theory that explains what's going on in these league tables, it transcends the education and health compartments that we would otherwise get. So I'm going to be very careful when I'm talking about searching for theory to try and distinguish between the program theories, the explanations for how things work, and the mid-range theories, which are the ones that typically have a label like social behavior theory, or the theory of planned behavior, or social capital exchange, or whatever it might be. So when you're at the level of trying to find program theories, one approach that we've used that has certainly had some success is to look for documents, full text documents, that actually try and unpick what's happening. And so a string of terms, some of which have been put together from a paper by Neil and Thomas down at the Epicenter, terms like logic model, theory of change, theory of action, outcomes chain, program spelt differently theory, program spelt differently logic, logical framework. And then you combine that, and you can see you can do a very sophisticated level search in Google Scholar by using the right syntax, using phrases, quotation marks, brackets, and the or and approaches here. And so I combine that with my postnatal depression concept. That is very broad, and you would use several synonyms. So maybe do this several times. And what this is doing is looking for articles that mention theory of change or logic model. And you can see from the examples here in highlights that there is mention high up because of the Google algorithm of theories of change or logic model. Now, the important point is that these, although they're high up, in most cases, they will not be there in the abstract. And this is why you're using Google Scholar and not so much the bibliographic databases, because the bibliographic databases will have abstracts usually, and they won't often tell you that they've got a logic model in or a theory of change. They may occasionally, but not as often as we would like. So some of the limits of looking for program theories. Many theories of change won't describe themselves as such, so they're very difficult to find other than following up citations from programs. Program theories or logic models may not relate to your specific focus of interest. So they may say something that we're going to look at the topic of postnatal depression, but we here we've got a logic model that relates to nutrition or something, some absurd example there. But so the logic model may refer to some other part of the article, not necessarily the thing that you're searching for. So that would result in a false hit. And also the theories of change or program theories may be outlined in other documents, so not necessarily journal articles. And we've got a way of dealing with that. But the sort of thing that we've found by using this method, the string that I've just shown you at the top of the article there, are explanations like here. So it's found the program's logic model had asserted that improving connections to community resources would improve family well-being, which in turn would lead to less emergency healthcare utilization. It's almost like the monoclonal antibodies that are going to lead to your initial program theory here. That we mentioned the next stage before to say that this is the stage that is closest to a systematic review search. This is the search for empirical evidence. So once you've generated your program theories, you want to find out articles that you can use to test it. And here we're trying to privilege all three of our R's, our relevance, our richness, and our rigor. We're looking for those holy grail articles that combine all three, but if necessarily, we will settle for any permutation of two of these. And so we go to our subject databases, again to the general databases as well. As we say, it's most like a systematic review search, but you're really creating a sampling frame. Just because you're doing what looks like a systematic review search doesn't mean to say that you're going to be using all the articles that you retrieve. In some cases, you'll actually be creating a sampling frame, maybe mapping where different studies lie, and it may be that your actual analysis strategy may be to dip into different parts of the sampling frame rather than as you would do with a systematic review with study 1 and go on to study 533. And Pawson actually says in many respects this is the search proper, by which he means the one closest to a systematic review. So you'll notice I haven't actually given you much detail on that because that is well covered in systematic review searching books. But just to reiterate that unlike the systematic review, where you use the PICO to narrow down to your included studies, with a realist review, you're mainly mapping where the studies fall and then deciding which ones you're going to use for the subsequent stage. And then the next stage is the searching to refine program theories. And we refine in two ways. We search for more contexts so that we can identify some of the nuances. And we identify and we search for our mid-range theories. We search for the explanations for why what is happening is going on. Now, there's several ways that we can do this. We can go back to that search that we've just described, the systematic review search, to see if there are any of those keywords in the reference management database. So, for example, if we had a database of men's sheds, we could search that database for the words leadership to see which articles would come there. But again, we'd only be searching the abstracts. We could do citation searching. We could do our Google Scholar searches again. We could also do something that I'll show you, which is where you combine citation searching with topic searching. So you harness both of those together. And in this context, I've come up with two of my dreadful acronyms, cluster search, which is for searching for concepts and contexts. So we're searching for rich studies and we're searching for thick descriptions. And which is specifically searching for mid-range theories. And these are documented, so I'm just going to introduce you to them, but just to show you. Just to say that we need to think carefully about how we're using theories, how reliable they are, and this is a useful reference from Davidoff, which gives you a few things to think about when you're evaluating your good theories to see whether they are useful. And it's this part, this linking with mid-range theory, that seems to be the bit that that is the miracle, to use this particular slide. And Ray Pawson seemed to imply that that you either need a miracle or you need someone like Ray Pawson in your project team to be able to do this. But we're suggesting that you could actually get a lot of the way by using some systematic search methods. So if you're interested, you can look at the origins of this particular debate, where advance the fact that I thought the Achilles heel was how you move from your evidence to your mid-range theory. And I said that there's a danger that you actually end up magicking things from the data that you've got. And Ray, being a participant of Ramesses, actually said that what you're really trying to do is part technical and part creative. So you need to use the sort of the generation of program theories as a starting point of the research, but you then need to plug in, if you like, to the mid-range theories. So this is a summary slide which shows how you can identify particular types of theory using different search methods. So we've already covered the program theory approach, the mid-range theory and included studies. We have a string there which combines together 4 terms that are indicators of potential theory in an abstract or a full text article. And then we want to move outwards from our included studies, from the review, to follow up leads, if you like, a bit of detective work. And in some cases, we might go as far as grand theory, which I'm not going to cover because that's not such a common purpose within realist approaches. So this is, if you like, our toolkit. Just to briefly introduce you to some of these. So cluster, once you have an index paper, which is exactly what you want, you then grow from that paper to find all other papers associated with that index paper. You do this through following up citations, through following the names of the lead authors of your index paper to see what else they've published. You look at unpublished materials, perhaps going to their websites to see if they've published any reports. You use Google Scholar to search for authors and citations. And then you also seek to find links from that index paper to other theories, to early examples, and to related projects. And so what you're looking for are what we call sibling studies or papers that were published from the same project and therefore share a context, or kinship studies that have shared origins in different contexts. So, for example, a model of peer leaders for AIDS may have originated in the United States. We may be studying it in the UK, but it may have been tried in Tanzania. And so the Tanzanian study would be a kinship study because we can track it back to the same original. The second approach is called Behemoth. Behemoth is specifically for searching for models and theories. Essentially, we describe what we're looking for. So another of my PhD students' attitude to NICE guidance in a public health or local government context. We don't want economic models, statistical models, so we not those, and we then combine it with these 4 terms that you can use either in bibliographic databases like Medline or in Google Scholar. And here is a sort of description of how we follow the Behemoth process. It's a mixture of detective work, following up these leads like authors, and doing the plod work, fingertip searching through the bibliographic databases. And I'd refer you to the paper that we both wrote that summarizes this. But essentially, it involves both searching bibliographic databases and following up mentions in our index studies. And recently had an inquiry from Singapore about how you do this and how far you go. And the answer is, if you're only looking for a single theory to pursue, so as a starting point perhaps for one of your mid-range theories, then you only go as far down this process as you need to go until you find a promising looking theory. If, however, you're doing a more comprehensive work where you're trying to look at all available theories, then you follow all of the steps that I outline. So you have a choice as to whether you're wanting a starting point into mid-range theory or whether you're going to document more completely. The other thing that you can do is to actually look for the occurrence of named theories with your phenomenon. So combining the name of a theory that you think may have a literature around it with what you're interested in. And there are source books that have these different listed common theories. There's the ABC of behavior change theories, for example. So if I was doing a study of for example, the NICE guidance, I might search for number 11 there, control theory, and the organization NICE, for example. And here's an example from actually the NICE project. So the diffusion of innovation is a very common theory, searching for that in conjunction with NICE guidance, or alternatively, searching for the full title of NICE within a citation search on Google Scholar for the work diffusion of innovations. So you'll see this feature here, search within citing articles, and instead of looking at all the thousands of articles that contain that particular citation, we're narrowing it down just to any of those that mention NICE. So this is what I meant by combining a named item and a cited search. You're searching for a named item within the citations. And this is how we've used this in a published work. This was a program theories for research capacity building. So we came up with a program theory, we articulated what it involved, and then we used these starting points to identify this third column of mid-range theories that might well explain what is happening here. And then we found quotations from our included studies that actually illustrate or support these program theories. So we didn't do an in-depth analysis of all of these theories. We really did it in the sense of trying to see how our program theories mapped out to the wider world. So I'm just going to sort of move towards a conclusion now, so that if you can be thinking of your questions. Just to say that there are some limitations of these particular ways of searching, that if we focus on lists of more common theories, we just might get the sort of received knowledge rather than new insights. But if we use the string model or theory or framework or concept, we should pick up even more eclectic theories as well. There's a labeling bias that some disciplines are much more prepared to name their theories, whereas others will just use theory. But again, those four terms will help counteract that. And the other thing, one of the problems with the way that we use theory is you might have something that relates to the right phenomenon, but the wrong timing or wrong point in time of the phenomenon, and this would be a false result because the theory will not apply very well, and you may go away and for something that's more located in the time in the decision path that you're interested in. And then finally, we come last but not least to documenting the search process. Ramesses only has two items that relate to documenting the search. One is scoping the literature, that's sensitization, and the second is for the rest of the searching process. We would encourage you to at least use the four elements of our search process when you're describing your searches. And also to look at something that I developed for qualitative synthesis, the 8 elements that you should describe around your searches. So the sampling strategy, the type of study, the approaches you used, the range of years, the limits, inclusions and exclusions, terms used, and electronic sources. So this is, if you like, a wish list of how to report your searching. But you'll be aware that the typical Prisma approaches with a single flow diagram, like the model we saw earlier, will not be appropriate. And so you should think about more phased and iterative ways of presenting the results from your search, such as in this example. So I did mention in my preamble that I sent to the organisers that I would briefly make contact with Realist evaluation here. This is just to say that the stakeholders and literature can be thought of as two alternative sources for information for the different stages of the process. So your background search would come from the literature. You wouldn't do a background search of stakeholders. You might do some preliminary interviews, but you're doing something quite different. So the literature for the background search, the searching for program theories, you could either search the literature and then go to the stakeholders, or go to the stakeholders and then search the literature. So that's that relationship. And then this cross swords approach here, you could either generate from the literature and test from the stakeholders, generate from the stakeholders, test from the literature, or in fact do both. So use both strands. When it comes to refining the program theories, again, you could go back to your stakeholders, you could go back to your literature. But the search for mid-range theory, once again, is something that you only do with the literature. So many roles there for literature searching in conjunction with realist evaluation, not just synthesis. So on to my summary slide, taking us just about the right point of a conclusion. So here we have the 3 R's: richness, relevance, and rigor. Of course, they don't specifically apply to formulating the question and documenting the search process. Conducting the background search, we privilege finding relevant. Searching for program theories, we want both rich and relevant items so that we have a bit of detail to articulate the program theories. Searching for empirical evidence is like this systematic review search, requiring both relevance and rigor, but we tend to make more use of the rich studies, and that's why we use the cluster technique to build up more detail. Searching to refine program theories, we're again looking for explanatory details, so we privilege this. And above all, we need to follow the requirement for systematic transparency. And the mention earlier of magicians sort of reminds us that when you see magicians on TV, they're not just whisking a rabbit out of a hat. They spend hours actually perfecting their trick so that it works every time. And so we're not talking here about a form of alchemy where you suddenly magic out your mid-range theory. We're talking about digging for nuggets. And in that context, the methods that I've shown you should help you in your quest. So good hunting. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Andrew. That was absolutely fantastic. I wonder if we could all just turn our mics on just for a brief moment, and we can do that celebratory round of applause that we would have had if we had been in a real life seminar room. So I wonder if you'd all just turn your mics on. Give Andrew a round. Thank you, Andrew. That was really, really inspirational. I've got so many points written down. I am actually looking forward to the recording. So everyone who joined late, we will be recording this and you can view it at a later point in time. We've had a few questions come in off the chat, and I thought it might be nice if people could ask their own question. We've had one come in on Twitter, which actually mirrors the question asked by Catherine Waldron as well. So Catherine, your mic on and ask your question if you have the ability to do that.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Hello, Catherine.
Yes, loud and clear.
A great presentation, Andrew. Thank you so much. I'm in the process of doing a rapid realist review search at the moment, and wondered if you could, I know in the limited time, highlight the differences that you can the shortcuts that you can take when you're doing a rapid realist search?
Well, I think all the tools in the toolbox have potential use, but I think the amount of program theories that you actually will be able to explore is perhaps more limited. And I think that you need to look at your three markers of rigor, relevance, and richness, and really prioritize within each of those lists. So, for example, picking for the more systematic search, perhaps using some of the tighter definitions around relevance. So we often would say restrict to a UK context when we're doing a rapid review, as opposed to the wider literature. The rigor, we may have a shorter list of study designs, but including qualitative research as well, because that's important. We're not talking about effectiveness. So essentially, I think all of the principles and tools have potential, but you just have to move your threshold higher up the list, and so you wouldn't go down so far and you wouldn't explore so exhaustively.
Thank you. Yes, that's helpful.
And sorry, just one last thing in terms of the databases you search would be to sample for difference rather than similarity. We tend, for example, to go for Medline, Embase, Cinal, Cyclid within a health context. Maybe one or two of those may be sufficient, but if there are other aspects, then maybe go straight to the social databases to get different types of literature and different perspectives.
And if I may just ask one last question, just in relation to you said about using or not the Prisma flow diagram. So in relation to the kind of details that you would be recording about, maybe, is it reasons for exclusion, or what sort of details are you suggesting there?
The examples I gave were more to capture the iterative, so it was like multiple Prisma rather than changing the level of reporting details. So I think it's really, you want the Prisma to reflect the design of your search. That was the point I was getting across. I think it's still important that you do have reasons for exclusion, even if they are generic, like I only went down so far in my list.
Right, yes, thank you. Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you, Catherine. Vicky Booth, do you have, are you able to ask your question?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Jo. Hi, Andrew. My question was actually regarding that the Prisma diagram as well, which has kind of already been answered. So I suppose it's just whether you have a kind of a good example or a good reference paper that you could direct us to regarding that. So a paper that's done it well.
Well, I think the example that I shared in the slide isn't a bad starting point. I think there's a general point as well. We did a study of Prisma back in the day, outside of a context of Realist, and you've really got a choice of what's the most important thing. Is it the chronology of your study, the order you do things? Is it the logic of your study, how you would like people to see your project? And so you really have some choices there. Or is it indeed something about the methodology? So I would say, if you're going to vary within the Prisma flow charts, then think about which is more important: chronology, methodology, or just straightforward logic.
Brilliant, thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you ever so much, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky.
Thanks, Vicky. Emma Kinley, are you able?
Yes, hi, good afternoon. Hi, I'm also conducting a rapid realist review at the moment, and I'm currently within the data search phase. And I just wondered if you could use the PCOS approach and still use the rigor, relevance, and richness in addition, just to support each other within the data search phase.
The PCOS, as I showed on my slide, is primarily around rigor and relevance, and so the richness part of it would be usually something that you discovered when you get to the next stage of the sifting. So yes, for that search for empirical evidence, you would probably be searching for rigor and relevance, and so it would look very much like the PCOS. For the others, though, for example, if you're searching for relevance, you would probably drop the O of and probably the C as well. And for searching for it might well be that you look for descriptions of the problem as well as for the intervention. So it might well be that you're looking for the problem and the outcome perhaps without specific interventions. So it's a good starting point, but don't be too bound by its sort of traditional boundaries.
That makes sense. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Anna Rosselli, have you got your question? Anna? Are you there, Anna?
Oh, sorry, I was just talking to myself. I'm on my laptop and not not on the Teams. Thank you very much for the presentation. That was really helpful. So my question was about managing like the scope of a realist review within kind of, especially as a PhD student, within kind of timeframes. And my question's kind of coming from my perspective at the moment, trying to kind of draw a close to my realist review, and then the kind of various avenues of additional search you can go down, which may be very useful, but kind of drawing the balance between things that may be useful versus kind of bringing an end to something so you can move on to the next thing.
Yeah, a very good question. I mean, I'd use a word that we don't tend to use very often in the Ramsey's community, which is prioritization, which is prioritizing both the theories that you explore in the first place, which obviously in your case it's a bit late to suggest that, but also the level of detail that you're going to do from your theories. So in other words, you know, sort of rank them on a page as to the ones that are most central and spend more effort. Don't feel that you have to do everything to the same degree. We did a funded project where we actually split into two, and we did a full analysis for 3 program theories, and we did what we called mapping for a further 5. Mm-hmm. So we had explanatory power across both, but not to the same level of detail. So it would be those sort of things. It's much more about managing the expectations than it is about managing the process.
Okay, thank you.
Andrew, we've got 2 more questions. Just depends how much time you've got.
I've got some time, but I won't be offended if people have to leave for other meetings. So I'll just hang around for those 2, if that's all right.
So the next question is from Pietanella. I hope I pronounced your name right, but please feel free to correct me. Can you turn your mic on and ask your question?
Hi there. Yes, it's Pietanella. No worries.
Not quite.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just interested to what your thoughts are on kind of sometimes finding instead of a theory that is kind of called a theory, sometimes you see just a particular article, like often a frequently referenced article being mentioned as some kind of explanatory theory. And how do you deal with finding those? And how do you, and as a researcher, if you feel that you are seeing particular commonalities between your, between the theories that the program you're looking at and a particular article that seems to suggest the same, can you use that instead of referencing to like a kind of like an official theory, more or less?
Oh, I certainly wouldn't endorse the idea of there being official theories. I think that was one of the dangers that that I was trying to flag up when I said that there's a danger that the answer to everything becomes the theory for planned behavior if you use a short list like I was suggesting. So I would encourage you to really use the list that I shared from the Davidoff study to evaluate that theory on its face value, but also think about the influence of, if you like, the community of practice. Look at what people have subsequently said. So people who've cited that theory, critiques or amendments, expansions, but also look at who that author makes their connections with. So again, it's forward and backward citation searching, accompanied by evaluation using a checklist like the Davidoff one.
Okay, and can I just ask a follow-up question? This idea that if you don't find any theories that have been written about that seem to fit fit what you're coming across, is it acceptable to just say, well, look, here are a couple of peer-reviewed articles that seem to be really summing up or very beautifully illustrating what I'm also seeing, even though they're not called theories?
It depends what that articles were conceived to do. So you don't want to overclaim. So if they are advancing it on a theoretical basis, then using them in that way is fine. It could be, though, that they're just really explaining your context they're adding another case study context for you, in which case you shouldn't treat them as any better or worse than your other case studies, if you like. So I would look at the claims that are being made, which again is linked to this, looking back at who they cite, how thorough they've prepared their theory, and looking at who cites them to see if other people have used them in the same sort of theoretical context, or whether they're just seen as illustrative case studies. Okay,
that's great. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Andrew, the last question is from Claire, but she's had to go. But I think it's quite an interesting one, because I think it's one that we've discussed a lot in our group at Not. So I'll read it out and you can offer your interpretation from it. Claire said, I am really interested in where people find the existing theories, mid-range theories, they use in their realist projects. Do you think it's always essential to go out and search for these? I suspect it might sometimes look like magic, because they are identified via project team members' existing knowledge and expertise and not by searching at all. I often feel unsure about this, whether this matters if the theory is still useful, or whether it is the transparency that matters the most. And she raises questions that I know that I've had with many of our own members, so it'd be useful to get your insights on that.
Okay, well, I have to first of all start with a disclaimer that I'm obviously at the less magic end of the spectrum, but I do appreciate that there is something of the wisdom of teams going on, and certainly, that's one of the things that I think I contribute to realist teams is other contexts in which I can bring in theories from. So I'm not trying to in any way sort of denigrate that as an approach. I just feel that there's a danger of a certain, if I can put it in quotes, arrogance in thinking that the team possesses all the knowledge required, and I think it's at least about, I was going to say going through the motions. That sounds like you don't mean to do it, but there is at least establishing the fact that you have made a reasonable attempt to engage with theories through the literature in a systematic way. So yes, some of them will come from the members' existing knowledge, but for them to be the only ones, I think would be a poor marker. So I think it's not so much about which ones end up getting used, because they will be sifted by the panel, but I think it's really important. I would just make a connection with when I first did systematic reviews, and the subject experts thought that they knew all the research that was out there. And it soon became clear when you do this systematically that even the experts have huge gaps in their knowledge of their expert area. And so I think it's the same with theories as well. So yeah, they both have a place, but I would say that you should at least take some steps to try and find the published theories, even if you find that they're not as useful as explanations as the project team members' expertise.
Andrew, that is absolutely fantastic. Just like to thank you again.